Nobody in that mall knew who she was married to. Nobody knew she hadn't been poor in years. Nobody knew that the quiet woman standing there, the one with the calm eyes and the perfectly pressed dress, had once scrubbed office floors at midnight with her baby sleeping in a car seat beside the mop bucket, just so there would be something to eat in the morning. Nobody knew any of that. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew that the text she just sent was only 3 words long. The slap still echoes off the marble floors of that luxury mall. That sound, sharp, flat, ugly, bounces off the designer storefronts and the high ceilings and lands in the chests of every single person standing there. People stop walking. A woman near the fountain covers her mouth. A security guard takes one step forward and then freezes. I'm not sure what he just witnessed. Children look up at their parents for an explanation nobody can give. And in the middle of all of it, Imani stands there. Her hair moves slightly from the impact. Just slightly. Like a tree that bends in a storm but refuses to fall. Her cheek stings. Her eyes water, not from sadness, not from shame, just the raw, involuntary response of skin that has been struck in public by someone who was supposed to have loved her once. But she doesn't scream. She doesn't cry. She doesn't grab his collar or throw her bag or collapse into the arms of a stranger, the way you might expect a woman to collapse when her entire dignity has just been attacked in front of 200 people and 50 recording phones. She simply reaches into her bag, pulls out her phone, types something, 3 words, presses send. And walks away. Slow, calm, dignified. Like a woman who already knows exactly how this story ends. Marcus laughs behind her. Loud enough for the crowd to hear. He turns to the strangers around him and spreads his hands like he's just won something. Like he's proved a point. Like humiliating a woman in public is the kind of victory worth celebrating in front of witnesses. He has absolutely no idea. He genuinely, completely, catastrophically has no idea what he just set in motion. Listen closely, because what happens next quietly destroys his entire life. And the most devastating part of all? He did every single bit of it to himself. But to understand what that text message truly meant, to feel the full weight of those 3 words, you have to go back to the beginning of Imani's story. Because nothing about where she stands today makes sense without understanding where she came from. And where she came from was a place that would have shattered most people beyond repair. Imani was 24 years old when Marcus told her he was leaving. She was 7 months pregnant. Her belly full and round with a life she hadn't planned, but had already decided to love with absolutely everything inside her. She had been setting up a small corner of their apartment as a nursery, just a corner because they didn't have much space. Carefully hanging a little mobile above a secondhand crib she had saved 3 weeks of grocery money to buy. She was standing on a step stool reaching up to hang that mobile when Marcus walked into the room with his bags already packed. Already packed. He hadn't even waited to have the conversation first. He had already decided, already loaded his car, already mentally removed himself from her life, from their child's life, from every single promise he had ever made. He said he wasn't ready. He said he felt trapped. He said he needed to find himself. And then he walked out the door. Imani stood on that step stool holding that little plastic mobile with its tiny stars and moons, listening to his car start in the parking lot below, listening to him drive away, listening to the silence rush in to fill the space where her entire future used to be. She stood there for a long time. Then she climbed down carefully because she was 7 months pregnant and there was no one left to catch her if she fell. And she sat down on the floor beside that secondhand crib and let herself feel every single thing. The fear, the grief, the fury, the loneliness, the raw terror of what came next. She felt all of it. And then she got up because she had no other choice. The years that followed were the kind of years that never make it into highlight reels. The years lived in the invisible spaces. The ordinary, grinding, bone-tired years of a woman doing absolutely whatever it takes, without anyone watching, without anyone applauding, without anyone even knowing. She moved into a single room in a shared house with 4 women and 1 bathroom, with walls so thin she could hear every conversation happening in the next room. She gave birth to her daughter Zara alone. No one held her hand. She timed her own contractions on her phone and breathed through every wave of pain by herself. And when the nurse finally placed Zara in her arms, this tiny, furious, a perfect creature blinking slowly at the fluorescent hospital lights, Imani looked at her and whispered one promise. It's you and me. Just you and me. And I will never let you down. She worked every job she could find. Call center during the day, supermarket shelves 2 evenings a week, and 3 nights a week. She cleaned offices because the pay was better, and the hours fell after Zara was asleep, and sometimes she could bring her, tucked into her car seat with a blanket, sleeping peacefully through the hum of the industrial vacuum, while her mother scrubbed bathroom tiles at 1 in the morning in an empty building. Some nights, Imani would finish a shift and sit in the driver's seat of her second-hand car and look at Zara sleeping in the back and feel two things at once. Profound, a bone-deep exhaustion and a love so ferocious it had no language. The kind of love that doesn't ask permission. The kind that simply exists. Solid, immovable, absolute. She never called Marcus and never asked him for a single thing. She had made a silent, private decision on that apartment floor the night he left. She was going to build something real, something no one could walk away from, something that didn't depend on a man who had already shown her exactly who he was when life got difficult. She studied at night, taking online courses in business and finance, reading textbooks on her phone with the brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't wake Zara. She was constructing something in her mind even when her hands were full of cleaning supplies, and even when she was too tired to feel hope, she kept learning. I kept preparing, kept building the invisible architecture of a future that didn't exist yet, but that she knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, was coming. It was a Tuesday night when she met Han Doyun during a late shift on the executive floor of a glass office tower in the center of the city. The floor with thick carpets and mahogany desks and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sleeping city below. Imani used to allow herself a few seconds at those windows between tasks. Just a few seconds to look out at all the lights and think about Zara and the future she was building one night shift at a time. She was standing there when the elevator opened behind her and she turned, expecting a security guard, but instead saw a man in a charcoal suit, mid-30s, with the kind of face that had clearly seen a great deal and chosen calm anyway. He stopped when he saw her, quickly taking in her uniform, her mop, and the bucket at her feet. The instant social calculation people make without realizing. But he didn't look away. He said, "You're here late." She replied, "So are you." He almost smiled and said, "I own the building. What's your excuse?" She looked at him evenly and answered, "My daughter. She's my excuse for everything." Something shifted in his face then. Not pity because she had no patience for pity, but something more genuine. Something like recognition, like a man who understood what it meant to work for something that mattered. He introduced himself and she went back to work, but he returned the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and not with grand gestures or flowers or expensive gifts, but with conversation, with questions he truly listened to, with a respect so consistent and quiet that it took her time to recognize it because she had never experienced it without conditions before. Han Doyun was one of the most powerful men in the city, his name on buildings and his decisions moving markets, yet the man who sat across from her in the staff canteen on Tuesday nights, eating vending machine sandwiches and asking about Zara's first steps, wasn't performing wealth or power. He was simply present in a way that felt completely unfamiliar to a woman who had spent years being left. It took time because Imani didn't trust easily, but Han was patient in the way people are patient when they find something worth waiting for. He met Zara one Sunday afternoon in a park, bringing nothing and making no speech, simply sitting on the grass and letting her toddle over at her own pace and examine him with the fearless curiosity of a small child, until she eventually climbed into his lap, uninvited, and grabbed his face with both hands. Han looked at Imani over the top of her daughter's head, and in that quiet moment she knew, not dramatically, not with fireworks, just a calm certainty settling in her body that this man was not going to leave. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony with close family, Zara in a white dress with flowers in her hair, walking proudly between her mother and the man she already called Dad. For 3 years, Marcus existed only as a faint scar, until one Saturday afternoon when Imani walked into a luxury mall, Keeg alone because Han was in meetings and Zara was at a birthday party, and near the fountain she turned a corner and came face to face with Marcus. He looked the same, a little older and softer, standing beside a younger woman glancing at her phone with mild boredom. Marcus's face flickered with surprise and then calculation as he assessed whether the woman before him was still beneath him. He noticed her quietly expensive clothes, the ease in her posture, the absence of need in her eyes, and something threatened inside him. He smiled the wrong kind of smile and said her name with condescension. She replied politely with the neutral calm of someone looking at a stranger who holds no power anymore. That calm indifference enraged him because rage is what happens when someone expects devastation and finds peace instead. Yet what happened next took less than 4 seconds. His hand moved, the sound echoed across the marble floor, her hair shifted from the impact, and in the silence of 200 witnesses and 50 recording phones, Imani reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, typed 3 words, pressed send, and walked away slowly and calmly like a woman who already knew exactly how this story would end, while Marcus laughed behind her, still believing the story was about him. The 3 words she sent were, "I need you," and the message went to Han Doyun, who within minutes was on the phone, and within 40 minutes had lawyers, security footage, and quiet corporate power moving into place. The video went viral before midnight because when people witness something that violates their sense of right and wrong, they share it so others can see it too. And what they saw was a man strike a woman and laugh. By the next day, Marcus had lost his job, his girlfriend publicly left him, eviction proceedings began, and his financed car was repossessed. When asked later if he had done anything to cause Marcus's collapse, Hans simply said he had not fabricated anything. He had only made sure the truth had enough light to be seen clearly. Marcus had destroyed himself long before that moment. Han had simply turned the lights on. 4 months later, Marcus filed for bankruptcy and moved into a small shared room with thin walls, while Imani returned that same evening to a warm home, a husband who held her face like something irreplaceable, and a daughter who fell asleep in her lap as they watched a film together. Now, the following year, Imani started a foundation for women who were once where she had been. Women cleaning floors at midnight, women sitting beside secondhand cribs, women building invisible futures in the dark. And she named it after the mobile with the tiny stars and moons because that was the night she decided that the real victory was never about what Marcus lost, but about what she built quietly, alone, in the dark, long before anyone was watching. Her name is Imani, and if you had passed her in that mall on any other day, before the slap, before the crowd, before the phones went up and the recording started, you would have noticed her, not because she was loud and not because she was performing anything for anyone, but because there is a specific kind of presence that certain women carry. The kind that comes not from money or status or the right clothes, but from having been through something that should have ended them and choosing, every single morning, to get up anyway. That is what you would have felt walking past her, something quiet, something earned, something that couldn't be bought. The coat she wore that day was deep navy, a simple cut, the kind of quality that doesn't announce itself but reveals itself slowly in the weight of the fabric, in the way it moves, in the absence of any need to impress. Her heels were low and practical, her jewelry minimal, just a thin gold ring on her left hand that caught the light when she moved. Her hair was pulled back with the effortless precision of a woman who has learned that the most powerful thing she can do in any room is simply take up her space and be completely at home in it. Her eyes were the thing, though. That's what people who met Imani always came back to when they tried to describe her. Not beautiful in the way that stops conversation, though she was that too, but beautiful in the way that makes you feel like the person looking at you actually sees you, like she had developed somewhere along the road of her life a particular kind of sight. The kind that comes from having needed people to truly see her when she was struggling, and finding mostly empty space instead. She had learned to see others the way she had once desperately needed to be seen. That is what survival does to the right kind of person. It doesn't harden them, it deepens them. But 3 years before that Saturday afternoon in that luxury mall, none of this existed. Not the coat, not the confidence, not the quiet, unassailable sense of self that made Marcus's hand hitting her cheek land with so much less damage than he intended. 3 years before that day, Imani was someone else entirely. Not a lesser version, never lesser, but a version still being forged, still inside the fire, still in the part of the story that feels like it has no ending worth waiting for. 3 years before that day, Imani was 26 years old, alone, exhausted in a way that sleep cannot fix, and raising a 1-year-old daughter in a single room with a window that faced a brick wall, and that is where the real story begins. The room was on the third floor of a house that had seen better decades, the carpet the color of something that had once been green, the radiator working on its own schedule, generous in October, indifferent in January, completely absent in February when it was needed most. The window latch was broken, so in the summer she propped it open with a hardback book, and in the winter she stuffed a rolled towel along the bottom of the frame to keep the cold from sliding in across the floor toward Zara's cot. She had made it as warm as she could, and that mattered enormously to her, that Zara's space felt warm. She had put up a string of soft lights along the wall above the cot, arranged Zara's few toys in a small wicker basket she found at a charity shop for £2, and taped a drawing to the wall, and a sunrise she had sketched herself one night when Zara was finally sleeping, and Imani's hands needed something to do other than worry. The room was small, the room was cold, and the room was also the most intentional space Imani had ever created because it was entirely hers and Zara's, and no one could walk into it with packed bags and drain the warmth out of it in under 3 minutes. She worked the call center Monday to Friday from 8 until 5. Her manager, a man who spoke to his staff with the particular brand of casual contempt reserved for people he believed had no other options. He was largely correct about most of them and entirely wrong about Imani, but she did not correct him. She smiled, she hit her targets, she was never late. And every Friday when her pay cleared, she sat at the small table by the brick wall window and divided it, rent, childcare, food, utilities, and whatever remained, which was rarely more than £30, went into a savings account she had named on the day she opened it, Future. £30 a week into an account called Future. That was her plan? That was the whole plan. And she believed in it with the complete, slightly irrational conviction of a woman who has nothing left to believe in except herself. Zara was the kind of child who made strangers stop in the street. Not because she was especially beautiful, though she was. She had Imani's eyes and a smile that arrived slowly and then took over her entire face, but because she was extraordinarily, almost unnervingly present. Even as a baby, she watched the world with a focused intensity that made people feel observed, locking eyes with strangers in supermarket queues and holding the gaze with such calm seriousness that the stranger would inevitably look away first, slightly unsettled as if they had been seen more clearly than they were comfortable with. She got that from her mother. Imani would take Zara to the park on Sunday mornings, their one slow morning without alarm clocks or schedules, and she would sit on the same bench every week watching Zara navigate the world with her particular brand of absolute determination, falling down and standing back up without checking if anyone had noticed, examining leaves and stones and fallen sticks with the focused reverence of a scientist encountering new data, approaching other children with a directness that occasionally startled them. Those Sunday mornings were the ones Imani held onto during the week, when the call center manager was being contemptible, when the radiator was being indifferent, when she sat in the car outside an office building at midnight, too tired to lift the cleaning equipment out of the boot for another 10 minutes. She would close her eyes and go back to that bench in the park. Zara's laugh, the particular way Sunday morning light falls through the trees in late autumn. The feeling, brief but real, of something that could only be described as okay. Not happy, not yet, but okay. And okay she had decided was worth protecting. Okay was worth every single thing it cost. The online courses had started as desperation and become devotion. She had signed up for the first one, an introduction to business finance, at 11:30 at night after reading an article about women who had built companies from nothing, sitting on the floor with her back against Zara's cot because Zara had been unsettled that evening and would only sleep if Imani was physically present beside her. She read the article on her phone with the brightness turned all the way down, and by the end of it, something ignited in her chest that she hadn't felt in so long. She had almost forgotten what it was. Ambition, not the hollow, anxious ambition of wanting to escape her life, but the deep directional ambition of a person who has identified exactly where they want to go and feels for the first time the specific excitement of understanding that the path actually exists. She enrolled in the course that night, £19 a month, moved it immediately into her monthly budget, reducing the food allocation by the same amount, and planning the week's meals with the precision of someone who has learned to make limited things go a long way. She studied the way some people pray, consistently, quietly, without needing to announce it. The material was dense at first, and she was always tired, but she discovered something important, that her mind, given something genuinely worth chewing on, became more awake rather than more exhausted, that learning was not a drain but a fuel, that every hour she spent understanding something new was an hour that belonged to the future she was building, rather than the circumstances she was surviving. She finished the first course in 8 weeks, enrolled in the second the same night, then the third, then a course on operations management that nearly broke her in the fourth week, but that she finished anyway, submitting her final assessment at 2 in the morning with Zara asleep 3 feet away, and her own heart beating with a satisfaction so private and so complete it needed no audience whatsoever. She was becoming someone, and she could feel it happening, not as an arrival, not as a sudden transformation, but as a slow, daily cellular accumulation of capability and confidence and knowledge. She was becoming someone who understood things, who could walk into rooms and know what was happening in them, who was building quietly and in the dark a mind that matched the ambition she carried. Marcus in those years did not exist in her thoughts. Yeah, not because she had suppressed him, but because genuine forward motion is an extraordinary antidote to backward focus. She was too busy becoming to spend any time being bitter, and that was the thing about Imani that people misunderstood when they eventually heard her story. They assumed the ending was about revenge, assumed the collapse of Marcus's life was the point of the whole thing, the payoff, the catharsis, the reason the story was worth telling, but they were wrong. Marcus's collapse was a footnote. The story was always about what she built before anyone was watching. It was Han who saw it first before she saw it fully in herself. That Tuesday night on the executive floor after she had gone back to work, and he had stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the city lights she loved to look at. He had thought about the way she said it, my daughter. That's my excuse for everything. Not with self-pity and not with the exhausted martyrdom circumstances sometimes produce in people, but with pride. Clear, clean, uncomplicated pride. He had been in enough meetings with powerful people to know that the rarest thing in any room was someone who knew exactly why they were doing what they were doing. Someone with a reason that was real and non-negotiable and completely immune to the opinions of others, and she had that. Standing there in a cleaning uniform at midnight in an empty office building. Yet he came back the following Tuesday because he was curious, and the Tuesday after that because curiosity had become focused attention, the kind that appears when a man encounters something he does not yet fully understand but wants to. He did not tell her the full extent of his wealth immediately, not from deception, but because he knew it would change the dynamic between them, in a way he did not want changed yet. He wanted her to know him first, the real him, the man who sometimes returned to the office at 10 p.m., not because he had to, but because thinking was easier there. The man who had built something significant and still believed the most important chapters were ahead. The man who had been hoping quietly to meet someone whose mind and values he could truly respect. He found that in a woman with a mop, a sleeping daughter in a car seat, £19 a month going to an online course, and £30 a week going into an account called Future. The conversations on those Tuesday nights moved easily across subjects with the addictive quality that appears when two well-matched minds meet. She challenged him, not to impress him, but because she simply could not accept an idea she disagreed with without saying so. He found this extraordinary because most people around him agreed with him reflexively due to his power, while she disagreed with his interpretation of a business case study at 11 p.m. in a staff canteen with the calm precision of someone who had done her homework, which she had, because Imani always did her homework. He revealed the company gradually, and she received each piece of information with the same measured attention she gave everything else, neither performing indifference nor reacting with opportunistic excitement. She simply absorbed the information and continued being exactly who she had been before hearing it. That more than anything was the moment Han Doyun knew with certainty that he had finally met the one person in his world who was not the slightest bit interested in what he was worth. She was interested in who he was, and for a man who had spent years unable to trust the difference between those two things, that meant everything. Han Doyun was not a man who lingered. That was the thing people who worked with him understood quickly. He moved through decisions, through rooms, through conversations with a focused efficiency that was not coldness but precision. He did not waste time. Not because he was incapable of stillness, but because he had learned early that time was the one resource that could not be recovered, and he had developed a near physical intolerance for its misuse. So when he found himself standing in the doorway of the 12th floor conference room at 10:53 on a Tuesday night, watching a woman he had never seen before scrub a conference table with the focused attention of someone performing surgery, and realizing that he had been standing there for longer than it would have taken him to walk to his office and retrieve the contract he came for, he noticed. He noticed the way he always noticed anomalies, with interest rather than judgment. She hadn't seen him yet. That was partly why he stayed. And not from any desire to observe without being observed. He was not that kind of man, but because the moment had a quality he didn't want to interrupt. There was something in the way she worked that held his attention in a way he couldn't immediately categorize. She was thorough without being mechanical. Her movements had an economy to them. Nothing wasted, nothing performative. Each pass of the cloth deliberate and complete before the next one began. She was clearly tired. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the particular quality of effort that comes not from the exertion of the moment, but from the accumulated weight of many moments preceding it. And yet she was completely present, not going through the motions, not mentally somewhere else while her hands did the minimum required. Actually there, in the room, in the task, giving it the full attention of a person who has decided that whatever they are doing deserves to be done properly regardless of the audience or the lack of one. He had sat across tables from people worth hundreds of millions of dollars who could not manage that. Then he saw the photograph. It was tucked into the frame of the cleaning cart. Small, slightly creased at one corner as though it had been handled often. A baby, maybe 6 or 7 months old, photographed mid-laugh, head thrown back, eyes squeezed shut with the complete physical abandon of an infant at the peak of joy. The kind of photograph that exists not for display but for survival. The kind you keep close because there are moments in a day when you need to remember exactly what you are doing all of this for. Something moved in his chest. Not pity. He examined the feeling carefully because he had learned to be precise about his own interior states, and pity would have been the wrong diagnosis entirely. It was closer to recognition, the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to have a reason. A real one. The kind that doesn't shift based on circumstances or convenience or how tired you are at midnight on a Tuesday. He must have moved. Or she sensed him through some instinct that years of being alone and responsible had sharpened to something reliable. Either way she turned, and for a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something moved across her face. Not fear. Assessment. The rapid, practiced assessment of a woman who has learned to read rooms and situations, and the people in them quickly, accurately, and without the luxury of being wrong. And whatever she read in him, she did not step back. He introduced himself simply. First name only, which was unusual for him in professional contexts, but felt instinctively correct here. She told him her name was Imani. She did not ask who he was or what he was doing in the building at this hour, which he found interesting. Most people encountering someone in an empty office at midnight default immediately to explanation and justification. She simply returned the introduction with the calm self-possession of a woman who considered her own presence in this space entirely sufficient without elaboration. He asked about the photograph. She glanced at it the way people glance at things they carry so close they sometimes forget others can see them. Then back at him. Her eyes did their assessment again, quicker this time. She said her daughter's name was Zara. Said it the way people say the names of things they would burn the world down to protect. Not loudly, not with performance, but with a quiet totality that left no room for misunderstanding. He asked how old. 8 months, she said. Then, because she was Imani, and Imani did not leave unnecessary silences to be filled by other people's assumptions, she picked up her cloth and returned to the table. Not rudely, with the straightforward practicality of a woman who is working a job that has hours, and those hours are money, and the conversation, though not unwelcome, did not change that. He watched her for a moment longer. She had turned away and was moving to the far end of the table, and she did not look back. And she did not perform any awareness of being watched, but something in the precise, a deliberate quality of her movements told him she knew his gaze was still there. He let it linger. Just a moment past the point of casual. Then he walked to his office, retrieved the contract, came back through the corridor, and paused again at the conference room doorway. She looked up this time. One eyebrow, barely. A question without words. He said good night. She said it back. Simply. Evenly. Like a woman who is not impressed by the fact of him, but is not unimpressed either. Who is simply, fundamentally committed to treating every human being she encounters with the same basic level of dignity she requires for herself. He took the elevator down. He sat in the back of his car as his driver navigated the empty city streets, and he looked at the contract in his hands without reading a single word of it. He was thinking about the photograph on the cart, about the way she had said Zara's name, about the quality of presence he had just encountered in a woman scrubbing a conference table at 11 p.m. who was also somehow the most grounded person he had been in a room with in longer than he could clearly remember. He was already planning to come back. Not the way men plan things when they are chasing. He was not chasing. Han Doyun did not chase. Not people, not deals, not anything. Chasing implied desperation, and desperation implied that you believed what you wanted might slip away if you didn't move fast enough. What he felt was different. It was the settled, patient, and quietly electric certainty of a man who has just encountered something rare and knows, with the same bone-deep instinct that had built his company from nothing, that the right response to something rare is not to grab it. It is to return. Consistently, honestly, until it trusts you enough to stay. He came back the following Tuesday. Same time, same floor, same unhurried quality to his arrival, as though a man of his schedule simply happened to find himself on the 12th floor at 11 p.m. by coincidence rather than intention. He had the contract under his arm again, a different one this time, she noticed, which meant the first one had simply been an excuse. And he stopped at the conference room doorway the same way he had the week before and said good evening, with the same measured calm. She said good evening back, and went on working. He did not try to extend the conversation beyond what it naturally wanted to be. That was the first thing she registered about him. Consciously, deliberately registered, filed away with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. He did not push. He did not perform interest or manufacture reasons to prolong contact. He simply appeared, exchanged a few minutes of conversation that went exactly as far as it went, and no further, and then left. The following Tuesday, he brought 2 coffees from the place on the ground floor that stayed open late for the building's night staff. He held one out to her with the straightforward practicality of someone offering a tool rather than a gesture. She looked at it for a moment, said it was unnecessary, took it anyway. Because it was cold on the 12th floor and the coffee was hot, and Imani was many things, but she was not performatively self-sufficient in ways that cost her a hot coffee at 11 p.m. He almost smiled. She noticed that too, the almost. The way his expressions approached completion, and then stopped just before, as though he had learned somewhere along the way to keep the most genuine versions of himself slightly in reserve. She understood that impulse entirely. She had built the same habit for the same reason. It cost something to be fully seen, and she had been in enough situations where that cost wasn't worth paying. They drank their coffees and talked for 11 minutes. She knew because she had checked the time when he arrived and checked it again when he left. Not from impatience, but from the practical monitoring of a woman whose hours were structured and accounted for. 11 minutes about the city at night, about the way empty buildings have a different quality of silence than empty streets, about whether silence is ever actually silent or just a rearrangement of the sounds we've stopped filtering out. It was not the conversation she would have predicted. She thought about it on the drive home. She did not think about it for long. The weeks accumulated the way weeks do when each one contains something small worth carrying forward. A coffee became two coffees and a question about Zara's latest developments. She was pulling herself upright on furniture now, teetering on the edge of walking with the furious concentration of someone who refuses to acknowledge that falling is a possibility. He listened to this with complete attention. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the focused, slightly forward-leaning attention of someone to whom the information genuinely matters. She noticed this without commenting on it. His employees noticed other things. The woman at the front security desk, 40 years in the building, sharp as a new blade, incapable of missing anything that moved through her lobby, mentioned to a colleague one morning that Mr. Han had been taking the elevator to 12 before going home on Tuesday nights. The colleague, who processed the schedule on the executive floor, mentioned that he had also begun shifting his Tuesday late meetings to earlier in the afternoon, clearing the evening deliberately. Neither of them said anything directly. They didn't need to. There is a specific quality of attention that a person pays to someone they are falling for. A gravitational quality, an almost physical orientation. And people who spend enough time watching human beings move through spaces develop an eye for it that is difficult to deceive. In the third-floor meeting room one Thursday morning, 3 of his senior directors watched his gaze drift to the window, midway through a presentation about quarterly projections. His head didn't move. His expression didn't change. But his eyes went somewhere else for exactly 4 seconds before returning to the presentation with the precise, almost aggressive focus of a man recollecting himself. No one mentioned it in the meeting. Everyone mentioned it afterward. For Imani, it was the laughter that undid her, not his laughter. Though Han's laugh, when it came, was the rare and therefore significant kind, unhurried and unperformed, and completely at odds with the composed precision he brought to everything else. What undid her was the discovery that he could make her laugh. Genuinely. The kind that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. The kind that bypasses every careful wall you have constructed and simply happens. He had said something. She could never remember afterward exactly what, only the texture of it, dry and perfectly timed and entirely unexpected. And she had laughed before she could catch herself. Properly laughed. And then looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been caught doing something they hadn't planned to do and isn't entirely sure how they feel about it. He looked back at her with that almost smile. She looked away first. That had never happened before. She drove home that night with something unfamiliar sitting in her chest. Not quite warmth. Not yet. More like the first barely detectable change in air temperature that signals before any visible evidence exists that something is about to shift. Her response to it was immediate and instinctive. She assessed it, named it for exactly what it was, and told herself with firm, compassionate clarity that she could not afford it. She had Zara. She had the courses. She had the account called Future that was growing slowly but genuinely. She had built a life that was hers in a way nothing had been hers before. The architecture of that life had been constructed specifically to not require another person at its center. Because she had learned at 7 months pregnant on a Thursday evening in February exactly what happened when you built your stability around someone who had not yet decided to stay. She could not do that again. She would not do that again. She was still telling herself this on the 5th Tuesday after the coffee, and the 9th Tuesday after the coffee, and the Tuesday 3 months in when he appeared on the 12th floor and said, without preamble, without performance, with the simple directness of a man who had decided that honest was the only approach worth taking with a woman who could detect anything less from across a room. Would you have dinner with me? Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Something in between. An offering held out with both hands and no conditions attached. She looked at him. Did the assessment. I found nothing in his face that resembled strategy or performance or the particular hunger of a man who wants something and has decided she is the most efficient route to it. What she found instead was the thing she had been carefully not looking for. Someone who was watching her, actually watching her. Like the most interesting thing that had happened to him in a very long time was simply her. The way she thought. The way she moved. The way she said no to things that didn't deserve a yes and meant it without apology. She almost said no. The word was completely formed in her mouth. And then something in her, that deep, quiet, structural part that had gotten up off the apartment floor, and folded the note and put it in the drawer and begun, made a different decision. She said yes. Simply. Evenly. Yet like a woman who is not certain of the destination but has decided, for the first time in a long time, that the road is worth taking. The restaurant was not what she expected. She had braced herself quietly and without showing it for the kind of place that announces itself. The kind of establishment that exists primarily to make the person who chose it feel significant. Floor-to-ceiling glass and architectural lighting and menus without prices and the ambient performance of wealth that powerful men sometimes use as a first move, a way of establishing the landscape before the conversation begins. Han took her to a small Italian place on a side street 20 minutes from the city center. 12 tables, candles and wine bottles. A menu handwritten on a chalkboard in someone's grandmother's cursive. The owner, a warm man named Sal who moved between tables with the unhurried ease of someone in complete mastery of his small kingdom, greeted Han by name and without ceremony, the way you greet someone you have known long enough to be done impressing. She filed that away. A man is revealed not by where he takes you to be seen, but by where he goes when no one is watching. They sat across from each other in the corner table, and the candle between them threw soft, uneven light across the space, and for the first 15 minutes, something in Imani remained, standing just slightly back from the conversation, present, engaged, warm enough, but with one hand on the door. She had dressed carefully and without overthinking it. A deep green dress, small gold earrings. Nothing that said she had tried too hard, nothing that said she hadn't tried at all. Yet she was aware, with the precise self-awareness she brought to everything, that she was being assessed across that table the same way she was assessing, and that they were both doing it with enough sophistication to make the assessment feel like conversation. He asked about her courses first, not about her job, not about her living situation, not the polite, slightly condescending questions that well-meaning people sometimes ask of women in difficult circumstances. Questions that are really just a frame for their own generosity. He asked about the courses the way someone asks about something they have genuinely been curious about since the last time it came up. He wanted to know what specifically she was studying, what she found difficult, what she found unexpectedly compelling. Now she told him about the operations management module that had nearly broken her in week 4. He asked what had broken her about it. Not to fix it, not to offer a solution, simply to understand. She explained. He listened with the focused, slightly forward quality she had come to recognize as his real attention rather than his polite attention. And when she finished, he said something precise and useful about the specific concept she had struggled with, and then asked a follow-up question that told her he had actually absorbed everything she said. She felt the hand on the door loosen. Slightly. They were an hour in when she mentioned Marcus. She hadn't planned to. It came up the way things come up in real conversations. Not as a prepared disclosure, but as a natural consequence of talking honestly about the shape of the last few years. Now she said his name once, matter-of-factly, in the context of explaining how she had come to be raising Zara alone. She did not editorialize, did not perform either bitterness or forgiveness. Simply stated the facts with the clean economy of someone who has processed something thoroughly enough that it no longer requires dramatic framing. She was watching Han's face when she said it. Something moved through his expression. Fast. Controlled. He controlled it almost immediately with the practiced ease of a man who has spent years managing what his face communicates in rooms where revealing the wrong thing has consequences. But she was too observant and too close, and the candlelight was too honest. It was not jealousy exactly. She turned the word over and examined it and put it back down because it didn't quite fit. A jealousy implies competition, And Han Doyun was not a man who experienced other men as competition. Not because of arrogance, but because of a settled self-knowledge so complete that the concept simply didn't have purchase in him. What she saw was something older and more specific than jealousy. It was anger. The quiet, controlled, entirely dangerous kind. The kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. The kind that belongs to people who have both the capacity and the resources to do something about the things that enrage them, and have therefore learned to keep the rage on a very short, very firm leash. He said, after a moment, "He's a fool." 3 words. Said with the flat, absolute certainty of a verdict that requires no supporting argument. Not performed. Not positioned for her benefit. Simply his honest assessment, I stated once and without embellishment, of a man who had been given something irreplaceable and had left it on a kitchen counter with 6 words and driven away. She looked at him across the candle. He looked back. And in that specific silence, 4 seconds, maybe 5, something shifted between them that could not be unshifted. Because what she had heard in those 3 words was not a man trying to position himself favorably against a predecessor. She had heard a man whose instinctive, unguarded response to learning that she had been abandoned while pregnant was a quiet fury on her behalf. Not pity. Not an opportunity. Fury. The protective, principled fury of someone whose values had been offended. Han Doyun did not see Marcus as a rival. The thought would have been almost laughable to him if it had occurred at all, which it hadn't, because you cannot rival something you have already become the answer to. Marcus had left a space in Imani's life shaped like consistency, like respect, like a man who stays. Han had been filling that shape, patiently and without announcing it, for months. He changed the subject after that, not to escape the moment, but because he had said what he had to say and he was not a man who repeated himself, and because what Imani needed from the rest of that evening was not to spend it looking backward at a man who had already taken enough of her time. He asked about Zara's attempts at walking. She told him, and somewhere in the telling her whole face changed. The careful, measured quality dropped away entirely, and she became simply a mother talking about her daughter. He lit up from the inside with a love so uncomplicated and so total that it transformed the air around her. Han watched her, not with the assessing attention of earlier, with something quieter and more unguarded than that. Something that, had she caught it directly, she might have found alarming in its completeness. He was not falling. He had already fallen. The falling had happened somewhere around the 9th Tuesday, probably, or possibly earlier. Possibly that first night in the corridor when she had turned around and looked at him with those completely unhurried eyes and said, "So are you." He had simply been too precise a thinker to misname it before he was certain. He was certain now. He walked her to her car at the end of the evening, and they stood in the side street with the cold air moving between them and the warm light from Sal's restaurant behind them. And he thanked her for coming. Sincerely, without theater. She said she was glad she had, and meant it in a way that surprised her on the way home. The clean, unambiguous, non-negotiable way of it. She was glad, genuinely and without qualification. For the first time in longer than she could accurately trace, she had sat across from someone and felt not the anxiety of being assessed, but the rare, unfamiliar comfort of being known. She drove home and checked on Zara sleeping and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at her daughter in the soft light. Then she sat at the small table by the window and opened her laptop. And studied. Because Imani had not changed, she was still the woman who studied at midnight, and still the woman with 30 pounds a week going into an account called Future. Still the woman who had built everything she had with her own hands and her own mind in her own time. She was simply, perhaps, beginning to consider, very quietly, very carefully, with one hand still lightly on the door, that the future she was building might have room for one more person in it, if he kept being exactly who he had been tonight. If he stayed. The wedding happened on a Saturday in October when the light was the color of honey, and the air had that particular autumn clarity that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. Sharper edges, deeper colors, the world presenting itself with an honesty that softer seasons don't quite manage. There were 22 people. That was the whole list. A family who had shown up during the hard years and therefore earned the right to be present for this one. A few friends who knew the full story. Not the edited version, not the highlight reel, but the single room and the brick wall window and the midnight cleaning shifts and the account called Future. Diane from the restaurant, who had hired a 7 months pregnant woman without asking for an explanation, and had become, quietly and permanently, one of the people Imani trusted completely. And Sal, who catered the entire reception from his restaurant kitchen and refused to discuss payment in a way that made further discussion impossible. No press, no announcement, no carefully managed public narrative about the CEO and the woman he had found on the 12th floor. Han had offered once to do whatever she wanted, big or small, public or private, anywhere in the world. He had said it with the straightforward simplicity of a man who has the resources to mean it completely and wanted her to know that. She had said 20 people, maybe 22, somewhere with trees. He had found a property 40 minutes from the city, a house set back from a country road with an old garden that had been allowed to grow into something honest rather than manicured, with oak trees old enough to have witnessed several lifetimes and a stone terrace that caught the afternoon light and held it. She had said yes to that too. Imani got ready in a small room on the upper floor with Diane beside her and Zara underfoot, 3 years old now and possessed of extremely strong opinions about everything, including and especially her mother's appearance on this particular morning. She had decided independently that Imani's hair should be down and communicated this position with the serene, unbudging certainty that she brought to all her convictions. Standing directly in front of her mother and pointing with one small authoritative finger until the matter was resolved in her favor. Imani laughed, the real laugh, the one that arrived before she could decide about it. Diane looked at her in the mirror and said nothing, just put her hand briefly on Imani's shoulder and squeezed once, and in that single gesture communicated everything that the previous years had been. The weight of them, the cost of them, and the absolute rightness of arriving here. The dress was ivory, simple cut, nothing that competed with her, and she had chosen it in 20 minutes in a shop on a quiet street because it was the first one that made her feel like herself rather than a performance of a bride, and Imani had long since lost patience for performing anything for anyone. She carried garden flowers, no florist. She had cut them herself that morning from the property grounds while the dew was still on them, and the light was still low and the garden was quiet, and she had stood there for a moment alone with the flowers in her hands and let herself feel the full, staggering distance between the apartment floor and this garden, between the note in the kitchen drawer and this morning. She felt it completely. Then she went inside to get ready. Han was standing on the stone terrace when she came through the garden doors with Zara's hand in hers. He was facing away, looking out over the garden with the composed stillness that was simply his natural state, and he turned when he heard them, and the composed stillness did something it almost never did. It broke. Not dramatically, not with any performance. Just a fracture. Small, total, completely honest, in the careful architecture of a man who had learned young to keep his most vulnerable responses behind glass. He looked at her the way people look at things that have required great patience to arrive at and have finally, actually, arrived. Like a man who cannot quite reconcile the fact of the present moment with every previous moment that preceded it. He walked toward her, stopped in front of her, said nothing for a moment because there was nothing that needed to be said, and Han Doyun had never wasted words in his life. Then Zara, 3 years old, flowers in her hair, wearing a white dress she had been extraordinarily proud of since the moment it was purchased, released her mother's hand and walked directly to Han with the focused determination of a small person who has made a decision and is implementing it. She walked up to him and held both arms up. He bent down immediately. Not the polite, slightly awkward crouch of someone unaccustomed to small children. He went all the way down, one knee almost to the ground, bringing himself fully to her level, and gathered her into his arms with the easy, practiced sureness of a man for whom this small person was already completely, irreversibly his. Zara pressed her face into his neck. Her arms went around him as far as they could reach, and she stayed there. Not a brief hug, not a polite child greeting. She stayed, settled into him the way children settle into people they have unconsciously categorized as safe, as permanent as home. Her eyes closed. Her small body relaxed completely. Han held her with his eyes closed too. Imani watched this from 3 feet away and felt something move through her that had no clean name. Not happiness exactly. Happiness was too simple a word for it. More like the resolution of a cord that had been suspended for 3 years. The moment when something that has been held in tension finally, gently, releases. Because what she was watching was not a man being kind to her daughter. She had seen men be kind to Zara. It was not rare, and it was not this. What she was watching was a man for whom Zara was not a complication to be navigated or a sweetness to be occasionally performed. She was his. The decision had been made somewhere in the previous 2 years. Quietly, privately, without announcement. And it was as complete and non-negotiable as any decision Han Doyun had ever made. He had fallen in love with Imani, but he had also fallen in love with the life she was building. The specific, particular, hard-won life of a woman who had chosen her daughter and her future account, and her midnight courses over bitterness. Who had shown him by simply being who she was on those Tuesday nights that integrity is not a concept but a practice. Daily, unglamorous, done in empty corridors with no audience. He had fallen in love with the woman who got up off the floor. Zara finally lifted her head, looked at Han with her mother's eyes. Those deep, assessing, completely unhurried eyes. I patted his face twice with one small hand in the ancient, evaluative way of children confirming a thing they already know. Then she turned to her mother with the satisfied expression of someone whose affairs are in order. Imani looked at Han over the top of her daughter's head. He looked back at her with the complete, uncomplicated fullness of a man who is exactly where he chose to be. They got married 20 minutes later. 22 people. Honey-colored light. Old oak trees. And a small girl with flowers in her hair who walked seriously and importantly between her parents toward whatever came next, already entirely certain of her place in it. 3 years of warmth. 3 years of a life so genuinely, quietly full that the years before it had begun to feel like something that happened to a different woman. Not forgotten, and never forgotten, but transformed the way scar tissue transforms. Still there. Visible if you knew where to look, but no longer open. No longer the thing that defined the shape of everything else. 3 years of Zara learning to walk and then run, and then argue with the focused precision of a child who had inherited her mother's inability to leave an incomplete thought unaddressed. 3 years of Han coming home. Not arriving. Coming home, which is a different thing entirely, a thing that requires intention and choice, and the daily decision to be present rather than simply physically located. 3 years of Sunday mornings without alarm clocks and a kitchen that smelled of coffee, and a man who read the news at the table and looked up when she walked in. The way people look up at things that still, after all this time, make the room better. 3 years of building. The charitable foundation had begun in the 2nd year of their marriage, in the way that the best things begin. Not from a grand plan, but from a specific moment of recognition. She had been speaking at a shelter on a Tuesday evening, which felt appropriate, and a woman in the 3rd row had looked at her with an expression she recognized immediately and completely. Not admiration, not hope yet. Hope comes later. Hope requires evidence. What she saw in that woman's face was the particular exhausted watchfulness of someone in the middle of the part of the story that feels like it has no ending worth waiting for. Imani had looked at her and thought, I know exactly where you are. And then she had thought, I know exactly what you need to hear. The foundation was operational within 6 months. Practical support, legal resources, financial literacy, childcare access, the specific tools that the gap between surviving and building actually requires. Not charity in the passive sense, but infrastructure. The kind of help that teaches a woman to construct something rather than simply enduring until the construction becomes possible. She named it after the mobile with the tiny stars and moons. Han had looked at her when she told him that. That look. The one she had first seen across a candle in a 12-table Italian restaurant and had never entirely gotten used to, which was precisely why she never wanted it to stop. This was her life on a Saturday afternoon when she walked into a luxury mall alone. Han in meetings, Zara at a birthday party. She was simply moving through her own ordinary, an extraordinary life with the unhurried ease of a woman who has nowhere to be but where she is and finds that sufficient. She was passing the fountain when she saw him. The mind does a specific thing when it encounters someone from a previous version of your life. There is a fraction of a second before recognition fully assembles itself, where you see a face and know it without yet knowing how you know it. A flash of familiarity before the name arrives. And in that fraction of a second, before context loads, you are neutral. Then context loads. Marcus. He looked the same in the broad strokes, same height, same build, slightly softer at the edges in the way that certain kinds of ease produce in men who have stopped being challenged by their circumstances. He was with a woman, younger, attractive, moving through the mall with the mild, beautiful boredom of someone who expects to be entertained, and usually is. She was looking at her phone. She was not paying attention to him. He saw Imani at the same moment she fully recognized him. She watched the calculation happen in his face. She had seen this calculation before, had experienced the receiving end of it her entire adult life, the rapid unconscious social sorting, the instinctive hierarchy mapping that people perform in the first seconds of an encounter. She was familiar with being assessed. What she was not prepared for, though she understood it the instant it happened, was what the calculation produced in him. Anger. Not the residual guilt of a man encountering someone he wronged, not discomfort or shame or any of the emotions that require a degree of self-awareness she had long since stopped expecting from Marcus. Pure, reflexive, deeply revealing anger. Because she looked well, because she was standing in a luxury mall on a Saturday afternoon in a coat that spoke quietly of a life he had not provided and could not claim and had no access to. Because her eyes, when they found his, contained the single thing his entire ego could not metabolize. Nothing. Not hatred, not residual pain, not the ongoing wound that would have confirmed, on some fundamental level, that leaving her had mattered enough to leave a mark worth maintaining. Just nothing. The complete, genuine, non-performed absence of any feeling that required him as its subject. He could not bear it. She saw it coming. Not the specific action. She did not predict the specific action, but the energy of it. The way his shoulders changed. The way he moved toward her with the too fast, too deliberate momentum of a man who has decided to do something before the part of his brain capable of consequences has been consulted. She had time to take one breath. The slap landed in the full acoustic honesty of a marble-floored luxury mall on a busy Saturday afternoon. The sound was enormous, disproportionate. The kind of sound that silences a room not gradually but instantaneously. A switch thrown, every other noise simply stopping. Her hair moved from the impact. Her cheek burned with the specific, clarifying heat of physical shock. And around her she heard the collective intake of breath. 200 people. And then the soft, multiple sounds of phones being raised, recording beginning. The contemporary instinct of witnesses who understand that documentation is a form of testimony. Marcus said something. She heard the words but did not process them. What she processed instead, with the calm clarity that sometimes descends in moments of acute shock, was the feeling in her own body. Not devastation. Not the collapse inward that he was anticipating and had perhaps counted on. Something far more unexpected. Stillness. A stillness so complete it felt structural. The stillness of a woman who knows, not intellectually, not as a performance, but in her bones and her blood, exactly who she is, exactly what she has built, and exactly who is going to answer the phone when she sends this message. She reached into her bag. Her hands were steady. She opened her phone. Typed 3 words. I need you. Press send. Put the phone back. Looked at Marcus once, not with contempt, not with triumph, simply with the honest, impersonal regard you give to something that no longer has any claim on your emotional resources. And turned. And walked away. Slow. The way she had walked away from everything that had tried to reduce her. With the unhurried, undefeated dignity of a woman who understood something Marcus had never learned and likely never would. That the most devastating response to someone who expects to break you is simply to remain whole. Behind her, Marcus laughed, turned to the recording phones like they were an audience that had come for him. Spread his hands, performed his victory to a crowd of strangers who were already, every single one of them, deciding something about him that he would not know until it was far too late to address. The text landed on Han's phone in a boardroom 40 minutes away. He read it once, stood up from the table, said simply, "Excuse me," and walked out. She did not go far, just the restroom at the end of the east corridor. Marble surfaces, soft lighting, the kind of carefully designed space that exists in luxury malls to provide the appearance of sanctuary. She pushed the door open and stood at the sink, and looked at herself in the mirror with the same direct, unflinching attention she gave to everything that needed to be faced. The mark on her cheek was visible, not dramatic. It would not bruise significantly. She had assessed this with the clinical detachment of a woman who has learned to evaluate damage practically before she allows herself to feel it. But present. Red. The precise shape of a hand. The physical evidence of a man's decision rendered on her skin in a public place in front of 200 witnesses and 50 recording phones. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned the cold tap on and pressed her fingers to her cheek and felt the shock of the water and let out one slow, controlled breath. Her phone vibrated in her bag. She already knew who it was before she looked. Han. Where are you? Not a question mark. Han did not waste punctuation on questions he had already decided to act on regardless of the answer. The absence of the question mark meant he was already moving, already out of the boardroom, already in the corridor with his jacket on and his phone in his hand, the meeting behind him abandoned without apology or explanation, in the way that only people with genuine authority can abandon things. She typed back, "East restroom, near the fountain. I'm fine." She sent it and then looked at those last two words and felt the slight dishonesty of them. She was not fine. She was not falling apart. She was not in crisis. She was standing at a marble sink with cold water on her cheek and her breathing controlled and her thoughts ordered. But fine was not quite accurate either. There was something moving beneath the surface of her composure. Not distress. Something older and more complex than distress. The particular feeling of a wound that you believed was fully healed, revealing under sufficient pressure, like that healing and resolution are not always the same thing. She had resolved Marcus years ago. She had done the work. She had put him in the drawer with the note and moved forward and built something real. But he had put his hand on her face in public. And that, the physical fact of it, the audacity of it, the profound and revealing desperation of it, was something that resolution alone could not fully metabolize in the space of 5 minutes at a sink. She heard the door. In a women's restroom in a luxury mall on a Saturday afternoon, the door opened and Han Doyun walked through it without hesitation, without looking left or right, without any apparent awareness that he had just walked into a space not designated for him. He walked in the way he walked into every room, with the absolute, unself-conscious authority of a man who has decided to be somewhere, and considers the question of whether he belongs there entirely secondary to the question of whether he is needed. He saw her immediately. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps. And then he stopped. Right in front of her. Close. His eyes went to her cheek and stayed there, and she watched his face do the thing she had seen once before, at a candlelit table in a 12-table Italian restaurant when she had mentioned Marcus's name for the first time. The controlled fracture, the thing moving fast beneath the composed surface, leashed immediately but not before she had seen it clearly. This time it was bigger. This time the leash was working harder, his jaw tightened. Not dramatically. not the performative clenching of a man signaling his anger for an audience. The involuntary structural tightening of someone processing a feeling that their body has registered before their mind has fully caught up with it. His eyes moved from her cheek to her eyes and back to her cheek, and the calculation she saw happening in his face was not about Marcus. It was about her. About whether she was okay in the specific, complete way that the word okay means when it comes from someone who knows your history. He raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, with a carefulness so pronounced it was almost formal. The carefulness of a man who understands that a hand raised toward her face right now carries the full weight of what just happened, and must therefore move with absolute gentleness or not at all. His fingers touched her cheek, the marked cheek, lightly, the way you touch something that has been hurt and must not be hurt further. His hand was warm against the residual cold of the water, and she felt him, beneath the steadiness of his touch, trembling. Slightly, just slightly. The single involuntary physical betrayal of a man whose composure was absolute in every direction except this one. She had never seen his hands tremble before, not in 4 years of watching him navigate boardrooms and crises and the 1,000 daily pressures of the world he operated in. His hands were always the steadiest thing in any room. They were not steady now. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, completely controlled. The particular quietness that is not the absence of feeling, but its compression. Everything present, nothing released. And he said, "Who did this?" Not loudly. Not with the hot, immediate energy of a man performing rage. With the cold, focused, almost clinical precision of a man asking a question whose answer he intends to do something with. She held his gaze. Said the name. Marcus. Han's hand stayed on her face. His thumb moved once, the smallest possible gesture, barely perceptible, a single slow motion across the edge of the mark on her cheek. Not erasing it. Acknowledging it. The way you acknowledge something that has happened to someone you love by simply refusing to look away from it. Then he dropped his hand. Straightened. The fracture closed. What replaced it was something she had not seen on his face before in quite this configuration. Not anger exactly. Anger implies heat, implies the possibility of being redirected or dissipated. No, this was colder than anger. More organized. The expression of a man in whom a decision has just been made at a level so fundamental that it requires no deliberation and will admit no revision. He looked at her for one more moment, with something in his eyes that was purely and completely about her, checking her, seeing her, making sure of her. And then he said it, quietly, almost gently, the way the most consequential things are always said. "I'll handle it." 3 words, matching hers. And she believed him. Not because he was powerful, not because of what she knew he was capable of mobilizing, not because of the corporate infrastructure and the lawyers and the connections and the quiet, systematic reach of a man who had built something significant from nothing. She believed him because she knew him, because she had watched him for 4 years do exactly what he said he would do, every single time, without exception, without theater, without the need for anyone to witness it. He kissed her forehead, his lips against her skin, just above the mark on her cheek. Brief. Warm. The kind of gesture that contains an entire language. Then he stepped back, straightened his jacket, took his phone from his pocket, and made the first call. His voice in the restroom was low and even and completely businesslike. The voice he used in boardrooms, the voice that had closed deals and redirected markets and ended careers. The voice that people who worked for him knew meant that the discussion was over and the execution had begun. She listened to 30 seconds of it, then she turned back to the mirror, looked at herself again. The mark on her cheek. Han's fingerprints of warmth still ghosted against her skin beside it. The contrast between the two, one the evidence of a man's cruelty, one the evidence of a man's love, both legible on the same face, struck her as the most honest summary of the last several years of her life she had ever encountered. She straightened, lifted her chin, and walked out of the restroom into the mall where 50 phones had recorded everything, and the internet was already beginning to wake up to what it had been given. Marcus was almost at the parking garage elevator when he felt it. Not heard it, but felt it. The specific atmospheric shift that happens when the energy of a space changes around you. Before your conscious mind has identified why, a prickling at the back of the neck, a heaviness in the air that wasn't there 30 seconds ago. The ancient animal instinct that precedes understanding by just enough time to be useful, if you know how to listen to it. But Marcus had never been good at listening to things that made him uncomfortable, so he kept walking. And the parking garage on level 2 was the kind of space that exists in the underbelly of every luxury building. All the brutalism that the marble floors above are designed to make you forget. Concrete pillars, fluorescent strips throwing flat, colorless light across rows of expensive cars. The smell of engine oil and cold air, and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces. The sound of footsteps carrying further than they should, and he heard them before he saw the vehicles. 2 black SUVs parked at angles that were not accidental. I positioned with the quiet, geometric precision of people who understand space as a tool. Their engines off, their windows dark, their doors closed with the specific weighty solidity of vehicles built for people whose security requirements have moved beyond the theoretical. And Marcus stopped, his hand still in his pocket reaching for his car keys. The keys stayed there, his fingers closed around them without drawing them out, the automatic action suspended halfway through by the realization that the car, wherever it was in this garage, was no longer the relevant destination. And 3 men in dark suits stood between him and the elevator, not blocking it with aggression, not posturing. Simply standing in the way that people stand when they are not there to negotiate, but to indicate that this is as far as you go and we both know why, and the next thing that happens is not our decision. And then Han walked out from between the 2 SUVs, walking slowly. Not the slowness of hesitation, but the slowness of a man who is in complete control of the timeline of what is about to happen, and sees no reason to rush any part of it. Still in his suit. The same suit from the boardroom with his jacket rebuttoned and everything in place. His phone in one hand, held loosely at his side with the casual ease of someone for whom it is simply an extension of their capability rather than a prop. And he stopped 8 feet from Marcus and looked at him. And that was the first thing. Just looked. And with the focused, impersonal attention of a man conducting an assessment, he finished in approximately 4 seconds, after which his expression settled into something Marcus could not immediately name, and would spend a long time trying to describe afterward. Not rage, not exactly contempt. Something closer to the expression of a person who has been presented with a problem. A small, manageable, entirely familiar kind of problem, and is now simply working through the most efficient solution. And he said Marcus's full name quietly the way you state a fact. Marcus opened his mouth, but Han continued as though he hadn't, and began to speak in the same voice he used in boardrooms, measured and precise, each sentence placed with the deliberateness of someone who chooses their words the way surgeons choose instruments. Not raising his voice, and clearly never intending to, which made it immediately and chillingly apparent that whatever was about to happen in this parking garage would happen at a volume that required Marcus to stand very still and listen carefully, somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. And he talked about the debt first, the specific figure not approximate but exact to the decimal point, including the interest accrued in the current quarter, saying it the way you say a number. You have been looking at long enough to have it memorized, which meant he had been looking at it, which meant someone had retrieved it, which meant this had been prepared before this conversation. Possibly before Marcus had even reached the parking garage elevator, and Marcus's face changed as Han moved to the next item. The contract irregularities from the previous financial year, the ones that had been flagged internally and quietly managed in the way certain companies manage certain problems, when the alternative is external exposure, and external exposure is expensive and inconvenient, citing the dates, the amounts, the names of the 2 people who had signed off on the arrangement in exchange for considerations that did not appear in any official documentation. And Marcus was very still now, the car keys no longer relevant at all, while Han had not moved or changed his posture or his volume or the unhurried, methodical quality of his delivery. looking like a man reading items off a list not because he was performing detachment, but because he was genuinely detached, because this was not personal for Han in the way Marcus needed it to be personal to feel manageable. This was not emotion, but information deployed with precision by a man who had spent 20 years understanding that information is the most reliable form of power because, unlike physical force, it cannot be resisted with physical force. And he talked about the money borrowed from a former business partner, the kind of borrowing with no repayment schedule and no documentation discussed in the kind of informal setting that produces debts settled in ways that do not involve courts. Naming the partner, the amount, the year, and Marcus made a sound, not words, just a sound, the involuntary exhalation of a person who has just felt the floor change beneath their feet. Well, and then Han stopped and let the silence sit, while the fluorescent lights hummed above them. And somewhere deeper in the garage, a car door closed, distant and unremarkable, belonging to a completely different Saturday afternoon than this one. And Han looked at Marcus with those quiet, impersonal eyes and said softly, "You slapped my wife." 4 words delivered with the same even controlled tone as everything before, yet entirely different because everything before had been information. And this was the thing underneath the information, the reason it had been deployed. The core of it stated simply without embellishment or theatrical weight. You slapped my wife. And in those 4 words, Marcus finally understood something he had fundamentally failed to understand when he raised his hand in that mall. That he had not simply struck a woman he used to know, or humiliated a former partner in public to satisfy some desperate cornered need to confirm a story about himself that reality had long since stopped supporting. He had put his hand on someone Han Doyun had chosen, protected, built a life around, someone he had stood in an October garden and made promises to in front of 22 people who knew the full, unedited truth of what those promises meant. And Han did not say what came next with heat or malice, but with the flat, complete, unanswerable finality of a man closing a door when he said that he had not fabricated any of what he had just told him, and had simply made sure the people who needed to know it had access to it, and that what happens next is the natural consequence of who Marcus had been for a very long time. And then he put his phone in his pocket, turned, walked back toward the SUV, got in, the door closing with that weighted, definitive sound, and Marcus stood alone in the fluorescent light of the parking garage with his keys in his hand, and the specific, devastating silence of a man who has just heard his entire future described to him, in a voice that never once rose above a conversational tone. The video was online before Marcus reached the parking garage exit. Not one video, but dozens. Shot from different angles and distances by different phones, held at different heights by strangers who had been moving through their own ordinary Saturday afternoons when the sound of a slap stopped them, and their hands moved to their pockets with the contemporary automatism of people who understand instinctively that what they are witnessing is the kind of moment that needs to be recorded. And the first one to gain traction was 47 seconds long, beginning 3 seconds before the slap, which meant it captured everything: the approach, the posture, the specific revealing energy of a man moving toward a woman with his decision already made. The sound, her hair moving, her stillness afterward, the phone, the walk away, and Marcus turning to the crowd with his hands spread, performing his victory to an audience that was already, every single one of them, documenting his face, and the caption on the first major share was 4 words. Someone find this man, and by evening they had. The internet, when it decides to look for someone, is not slow and it is not merciful, and it does not distinguish between the person it is looking for and the full accumulated record of who that person has been. Every decision, every cruelty, every corner cut, every debt avoided, every bridge burned, and every person left holding the cost of the burning. It finds all of it, surfaces all of it, and presents all of it simultaneously to an audience of millions who have already decided from 47 seconds of footage exactly how they feel. And by Sunday morning, the video had been viewed 4 million times. And by Sunday afternoon, Marcus's full name was in the caption of every major share. And his employer, a mid-sized financial services firm whose brand rested almost entirely on the language of trust and integrity, and whose website contained 3 separate paragraphs about the values they expected their people to embody, saw the video at 9 a.m. on Sunday when their social media manager sent it to the CEO with a single line of text beneath it, saying he works for us, and the meeting that followed lasted 11 minutes. Marcus receiving the call at 10:47 informing him that his contract had been terminated with immediate effect, that there would be no reference and no severance beyond the legal minimum, and that a statement would be released that afternoon, clarifying the company's position, their values, and their absolute commitment to a culture that did not tolerate the behavior documented in the video circulating online. And he tried to argue, but there was no one left on the line to argue with. The girlfriend, the pretty one who had been looking at her phone with mild boredom while Marcus positioned himself for the confrontation, had already made her decision before the termination call, because she had watched the video at midnight on Saturday with the growing clarifying dread of a woman recognizing something she had been explaining away for a long time. Not the slap in isolation, but the slap as the thing that finally gave legible form to a pattern she had been feeling without being able to name. And she did not call him, but instead posted a brief and precise statement written in the careful language of a person who has consulted their own dignity and decided to speak from there, saying she did not condone what she had witnessed, that she had not known, and that she was sorry to the woman in the video. And then she removed every photograph from her accounts, not with the dramatic attention-seeking deletion of someone performing a breakup publicly, but with the quiet, thorough removal of a person excising something from their record, and she blocked his number and did not look back. The apartment went next when his landlord, a 62-year-old man who had built a small property portfolio over 30 years through the kind of patient, unglamorous accumulation that requires discipline rather than brilliance, enforced a long-held informal policy about the kind of tenants he housed, sending the notice on Monday morning through entirely proper legal channels with every required period of notice observed and documentation entirely above reproach. And the car went the following Wednesday because it was on a finance agreement structured around a salary that no longer existed. The first missed payment, triggering an automatic review that confirmed his employment status, and scheduled repossession with the mechanical efficiency of a process that required no malice to be devastating, only procedure. And he came out of the building on Wednesday morning and stood on the pavement where his car had been, and looked at the empty space for a long time. What happened to Marcus in the weeks that followed was not, and this was the part many people struggled to fully absorb, the result of anything fabricated because Han had said it in the parking garage in the same flat, even voice that never rose above a conversational tone and had meant every word with the precision he brought to every statement he made. He had not created Marcus's debts, had not invented the contract irregularities, had not manufactured the borrowed money or the informal arrangement, or the decade of decisions made in the comfortable assumption that consequences were things that happened to other people. People without his particular talent for managing narratives and presenting surfaces that didn't match interiors and being believed by those who had not yet been given sufficient reason not to. Han had simply ensured that the truth had enough light to be seen clearly, and that was the entirety of his involvement, because the truth did the rest, since the truth had been there all along, patient and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to Marcus's management of it, accumulating in the dark the way things accumulate when they are never addressed, every debt deferred and every corner cut, and every person left holding something Marcus had promised to carry, all of it waiting and requiring nothing more than sufficient illumination to become visible to the people who needed to see it. And Marcus filed for bankruptcy 4 months after the Saturday in the mall, and moved into a room in a shared house on the 3rd floor with thin walls and a window that faced a brick wall, and a radiator that worked on its own schedule. The specific structural silence of a life reduced to its essential dimensions by the weight of everything that had been built on nothing real. And he had time in that room to think about a woman he had left on a step stool holding a mobile with tiny stars and moons on it, about 7 words on a piece of paper on a kitchen counter on a Thursday evening in February, about the particular arithmetic of a life and the way what you give determines what you build, and what you build determines what survives when the light comes on. And the light always eventually comes on, because he had left her with nothing, and she had taken nothing and built everything, while he had left himself with everything he thought mattered, and it had turned out to be made of paper, and the cruelest detail, the one that settled into him slowly in that room over those months, was not what he had lost, but the understanding that he had never been dismantled by Han Doyun. He had been dismantled by himself methodically over years. one decision at a time, and Han had simply arrived at the moment when the dismantling was already complete and turned the lights on so everyone could see it clearly. And that was all, and that was enough. She returned on a Tuesday, not deliberately and not as a statement or a reclamation, or any of the symbolic acts that stories sometimes require their characters to perform, to signal that healing has occurred, but simply because Zara needed new shoes. And the best children's shoe shop was in that mall, and Tuesday afternoons were when the crowds thinned and the parking was easier. And Imani's life, yani even now, and even within the fullness of everything it had become, ran on the practical logic of a woman who had learned to organize her time like it mattered, because it did and always had. And she held Zara's hand through the main entrance. Zara, 4 years old now, solidly and emphatically 4, a person of considerable opinions and complete physical confidence, walking with the decisive stride of someone who knows where they are going, even when they do not yet know where that is. Wearing a yellow coat she had selected herself and that Imani had stopped having opinions about approximately 3 weeks after the Battle of the Yellow Coat, had made clear that Zara's position on the matter was non-negotiable. Yeah, and they walked through the entrance into the atrium where Imani felt the marble floors beneath her feet and heard the ambient sound of the space, the fountain and the distant music, and the overlapping conversations of 100 people moving through their own ordinary afternoons. And she waited because, in the months since that Saturday, she had wondered whether returning would produce something, whether the body keeps its own record independent of the mind's processing, and whether she would feel the echo of the slap, the way people feel the ghost of old injuries when the weather changes, whether standing in this specific place would surface something she had not finished with yet, but she felt nothing of the kind. And what she felt standing in the atrium of that mall with her daughter's hand, warm in hers, was the specific quality of peace that is not the absence of something, but the presence of something. Not the peace of someone who has suppressed or avoided or managed their way around a difficult thing, but the peace of someone who went through it completely and honestly without shortcuts, and came out the other side carrying only what was real, a feeling entirely different from numbness, because she had known numbness in the first years after Marcus left. The functional protective flattening that allows a person to keep moving when feeling everything at full volume would make movement impossible. But this was nothing like that. This was warm and alert. Yet a woman standing in a public place with full access to every one of her senses, and finding in the sum of what those senses returned nothing that required defending against. Just a mall, just marble floors and a fountain and a Tuesday afternoon. Just her daughter pulling her toward the shoe shop, with the focused urgency of someone for whom new shoes are among the most significant events a week can contain. And she let herself be pulled, and they spent 40 minutes in the shop where Zara tried on 7 pairs with the methodical seriousness of someone conducting a rigorous process of elimination. Walking to the small mirror at the end of the fitting bench, after each pair, and examining herself with her head tilted at the precise angle of a person applying genuine critical standards while the shop assistant, a young woman who began the appointment with the patient professionalism of someone accustomed to small children, and ended it with what appeared to be genuine investment in the outcome, offered opinions when consulted, and wisely withheld them when not. And Zara ultimately chose the pair she had identified within the first 3 minutes, after which Imani paid, took the bag, held out her hand, and Zara took it. And they walked back out into the atrium where Imani felt it then. Not something dark and nothing residual or unwelcome, but simply an awareness. The way you notice a place that was once significant and find in the noticing the evidence of your own distance from it. Because she had been slapped here, she had sent a text here, and she had walked away slowly and calmly with every remaining piece of her dignity intact, while the world rearranged itself in the weeks that followed in ways she had not engineered and had not needed to. And she stood for a moment near the fountain, while Zara watched the water with the total, unhurried absorption of a 4-year-old encountering something worth encountering. And Imani looked at the same water and thought about the version of herself who had stood approximately there on a Saturday afternoon, and felt a man's hand on her face and reached into her bag with steady hands and typed 3 words, thinking about what those words had meant not only as a signal for help, but as the summary of something she had spent years learning. That strength is not the absence of needing anyone, and that the woman who had scrubbed floors at midnight and studied by phone light and put 30 pounds a week into an account called Future had never been building toward independence from human connection, but toward the right human connection, the kind that does not diminish you, the kind that stands behind you without standing over you. The kind where I need you is not a confession of weakness, but a statement of trust so complete it requires no explanation. And Han had answered in 4 minutes. He had been in a boardroom 40 minutes away and read those 3 words and stood up from a table full of powerful people and walked out without looking back. And that was love. Not the decorative kind, but the structural kind. The kind that shows up in parking garages and restrooms and holds your face with trembling hands and says, I'll handle it, in a voice so quiet it sounds almost gentle, yet means something the people who should fear it absolutely should. And she squeezed Zara's hand, and Zara looked up with her mother's eyes, that same deep, unhurried gaze, before returning her attention to the fountain entirely untroubled by the history of the floor beneath her feet, which was right and correct and exactly as it should be, because that history was not her story to carry, but Imani's story. And Imani had already decided what to do with it, not bury it and not perform it, and not define herself by it in either direction, neither as its victim nor its conqueror, because both would have kept Marcus at the center of a story he had never deserved to anchor. Instead, she would use it, and she already was using it in every woman who sat in a shelter and heard her speak. Every woman who found the foundation's resources at 2 in the morning, in a single room with thin walls and a window facing a brick wall. Every woman who read about her and felt in the specific cellular way that real stories produce real recognition, that the distance between where she was and where she could be was not theoretical and not reserved for other women and not conditional on circumstances changing before the work of change began, that the distance was crossable because she had crossed it herself, not in one movement and not in a single dramatic transformation, but in the daily, invisible, accumulative way real distances are covered. One night shift, one online course, one 30-pound deposit, one Tuesday evening conversation, one yes that arrived before she could decide not to mean it. And when Zara tugged her hand ready to go, Imani looked at the fountain once more, and then turned away from it without ceremony and without weight. The way you turn away from something that no longer has anything left to say to you. And she walked toward the exit with her daughter's hand in hers, and the Tuesday afternoon light pouring through the glass roof of the atrium, the shoe bag swinging from her other hand, and the absolute unperformed earned quietness of a woman who has arrived fully and finally without reservation at the life she built in the dark before anyone was watching. That evening, Han came home at 6:43. Not a remarkable time and not early enough to be a gesture or late enough to require explanation. 6:43 on a Tuesday evening, which meant he had left the office before the work was finished, because the work of a man who had built what he had built was structurally incapable of ever being finished. And he had made the choice that the table mattered more than the desk, a choice he made consistently, though not every day, because some days the desk won, and he called ahead and Imani put a plate in the oven, and they talked after Zara was asleep. But most days, most ordinary and unremarkable days, he came home. And he came home the way she had always needed someone to come home, which was without theater and without the performance of sacrifice. Never arriving announcing that he had left early for them, but simply arriving, putting his keys in the bowl by the door, loosening his tie on the way to the kitchen, asking what needed doing with the ease of a man who considered himself a participant in his own household, rather than a guest of honor being hosted in it. And Zara was already at the table when he walked in, because she had been there for 20 minutes, occupying herself with a small collection of toys arranged in a configuration that had its own internal logic invisible to anyone outside her imagination, narrating something under her breath, an ongoing and complex story with an apparently extensive cast of characters whose dramas she was managing with the focused authority of a showrunner who knew exactly where the season was going. And she looked up when Han appeared, and her face did the thing it always did, that slow, total smile beginning in her eyes before reaching her mouth. The smile of a child who had learned through 4 years of consistent evidence that this particular person arriving in this particular room was one of the reliable good things in a world still being cataloged for good and bad. And she said his name the way she always said it. Just his name, but with a weight of familiarity and ownership and uncomplicated love that made the single word contain everything. And he sat down at the table across from her, not after washing his hands or checking his phone or completing any transitional rituals adults use to decompress between the world outside and the world inside, but immediately. in his suit with his loosened tie and his day still on him, looking at the arrangement of toys on the table with genuine attention and asking what was happening, and Zara told him, telling him for 10 minutes while Imani stood at the kitchen counter, watching the clock because sometimes she liked to know the exact dimensions of a moment. 10 minutes and 14 seconds during which her 4-year-old daughter described with detailed narrative commitment the complete ongoing storyline of the toys on the table, including their names, relationships, the conflict driving the plot, the resolution she was considering but had not yet chosen, because there were two options, and both had consequences she was still evaluating. And the backstory of the one with the blue hat, which was extensive and involved a journey Zara described with geographic specificity, that suggested she had thought about it a great deal. And Han listened. Not with the fond, distracted half-attention adults often give children, but the way he listened in boardrooms, completely and with the forward engaged quality of someone to whom the information being delivered was genuinely the most interesting thing currently available, asking real questions about the Blue Hat's backstory and the origin of the conflict, and why the resolution she was considering might have the consequences she had identified, asking with the serious curiosity of a man who had decided at some point, a moment Imani could not pinpoint but suspected was around the day, Zara climbed into his lap in a park and grabbed his face with both hands, that this child's inner world deserved the same quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And Zara, who had inherited her mother's ability to distinguish real attention from performed attention with occasionally uncomfortable accuracy, gave him everything, every detail and character note and plot consideration, talking with her hands and her whole face, leaning forward over the table entirely certain of her audience, in the way children are certain, when they have been shown repeatedly and without exception, that they will not be left mid-sentence. And Imani stood at the counter watching them, because this was the moment she returned to later. Not the mall or the parking garage or the viral video, or the bankruptcy filing or the neat karmic symmetry of Marcus's life, reduced to the dimensions of the life he had once left her to survive alone. Those things had happened and were finished, and she had turned away from the fountain without weight. But this was the moment that mattered. This specific, ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday evening, with the kitchen light warm and yellow and Zara's voice filling the room with the particular music of a child who feels completely safe, and Han's face across the table focused and present and entirely given over to a 4-year-old's toy narrative with the same attention he gave to decisions worth millions. And she thought about Marcus not with bitterness or heat, but with the clear, impersonal accuracy of someone examining a thing from a sufficient distance to see its true dimensions. Because Marcus had taught her what love was not through malice since she had released the narrative of his malice years ago, because malice would have required him to think about her more carefully than he ever had, but through indifference and the slow revelation accumulated over years and confirmed definitively on a Thursday evening in February, that she existed in his life as a supporting character, in his own story rather than a full human being, with an interior life that deserved to be witnessed. And she had not known before Marcus that she was settling because you cannot identify the absence of something you have never been given. And Han had given her the thing she had not known she was missing, and in doing so had made its absence in everything before him retroactively legible, the attention, the consistency, the quality of being seen completely without editing or condition by someone whose seeing of her was not contingent on what she was providing, or how convenient her needs were, or whether she was presenting the manageable version of herself, because he had seen her with the mop and the cleaning cart, and the photograph of Zara and 30 pounds a week going into an account called Future, and he had seen her and stayed, and kept seeing her every version, every difficult Tuesday. Every morning she brought her full, complicated, non-negotiable self to the kitchen. And he looked up from the news the way people look up at things that still after all this time make the room better. And that was it. That was the whole of it. Protection was part of it. The parking garage and the quiet voice and the trembling hands on her face. Respect was part of it. The courses and the foundation and the absolute consistency with which he treated her work and her mind and her judgment as things worth taking seriously, showing up was part of it. 6:43 on a Tuesday and 10 minutes of toy narrative and questions about the Blue Hat's backstory, but underneath all of those things was something simpler. He had decided she was worth staying for, and then he had stayed. every day without announcement, without requiring gratitude for it, without holding it over her as evidence of virtue or sacrifice. Simply staying in the quiet, daily, undramatic way real love actually works when it is not performing itself for anyone. And when Zara finished her story, Han said something she could not hear clearly from the counter. And only the tone of that low, even voice warmed by the softness it held, only in this house with these two people. And Zara laughed the way she laughed when something genuinely delighted her, head thrown back and eyes closed and completely unself-conscious. And Han looked up across the kitchen and found Imani's eyes and said nothing. Just looked at her with that full, uncomplicated, non-negotiable look. And she looked back while the kitchen stayed warm and the light stayed yellow and Zara kept laughing. And outside the Tuesday evening went on doing whatever Tuesday evenings do when no one is watching them. And Imani thought quietly that this was it. Not the destination or the reward or the end of a story that needed a resolution to justify its difficult beginning, but simply this, the ordinary, extraordinary, daily, irreplaceable this. The beach was an hour from the city, and they had found it 3 summers ago by accident. A wrong turn off a coastal road, a dirt track that Han had followed on instinct, despite Zara's vocal skepticism from the back seat. And then the track opening suddenly onto a stretch of sand, so unhurried and unannounced that it felt less like a discovery and more like something that had been waiting specifically for them to find it when they were ready. And they had come back every summer since, and it was theirs in the way that places become yours not through ownership, but through accumulation. Through enough mornings and enough evenings and enough ordinary hours spent in a space until your presence has been absorbed into it, until the light there is familiar, and the sound of it is familiar, and your body knows stepping onto it that it has been here before, and intends to return, and the children were at the water's edge. Zara, 7 now, long-limbed and fast, her mother's eyes in her father's determined stride, attempting to teach her brother something about waves. He 2.5 with his own extremely clear position on waves, that they were personally targeted at him, and should be treated with the focused suspicion appropriate to something whose motives were unclear, standing at the edge where the water reached the sand, and regarding the ocean with the same serious assessing gaze Zara had once turned on Han in a park, with roughly the same result, complete refusal to be rushed into any conclusion before the evidence was sufficient. And Zara was patient with him in the specific way eldest children are patient when they have decided to be, completely and then suddenly not at all, and then completely again, holding his hand, talking him through it, clearly appointed herself the authority on waves and took the responsibility seriously, while Han watched them from where he sat beside Imani on the sand, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, shoes somewhere behind them, watching his children at the water's edge with the expression he wore in these moments, one with no professional application, no strategic dimension, no audience beyond himself and whatever he felt, when the life he had built presented itself to him this completely and simply, and the sun was low, the light long, golden, unhurried, late afternoon on a west-facing coast, making everything it touched look like the best version of itself. The sound of the water consistent and clean, somewhere down the beach a dog running in wide, joyful arcs that had no destination and required none. And Imani had her knees drawn up, arms loosely around them, watching Zara talk her brother through the waves with an expression containing everything and requiring no translation. The silence between her and Han, the kind that accumulates in long marriages. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of so much shared context that language becomes optional, having sat in versions of this silence on hundreds of evenings and it never felt like distance. The most honest form of company available, and she spoke without looking at him. Voice quiet, unhurried. The question not building dramatically, but arriving the way things arrive after years, surfacing without urgency from somewhere deep and settling into the ordinary warmth of a late afternoon, asking if he had really meant it when he had said he could make Marcus disappear. The exact words from the parking garage, the ones said in the flat, even almost gentle voice that had not raised itself above a conversational tone and had not needed to. She had not asked him about it in the years since. Not because avoiding, but because the question had not been ready until now. Until enough distance and enough peace and enough of this specific golden light held it without it meaning anything other than what it was. Simple curiosity from a woman who knew the answer and wanted to hear it. said aloud once, here in this place. On this evening, with their children at the water's edge and the dog running its joyful, purposeless arcs down the beach, Han quiet for a moment, looking at the ocean the way he looked at things he considered precisely, with focused, slightly distant attention, giving the question what it deserved rather than reaching for the first available answer. Then turning to her, every word said the same way he said everything that mattered, quietly, without embellishment, with the flat, complete, unanswerable certainty of a man who does not make statements. He hasn't examined fully and does not soften truths to make them easier to receive. Every word. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the water, and something in her chest settled. Not because the answer surprised her, it didn't. And she had known it with the same bone-deep accuracy she had always known the important things about Han, but because there is a specific comfort in hearing confirmed in plain language in the golden light of a late afternoon on a beach that belongs to them both. That she was never alone in that parking garage. That the trembling hands on her face in the restroom were connected to something real and non-negotiable, and operating entirely on her behalf. That she had been protected, not in the way that diminishes or replaces her own capability, or crowds out her own agency, or requires her to be smaller in exchange for being covered, but in the way that expands, the way that allows a person to be fully themselves because they know, not theoretically but practically, and evidenced by 4 years of consistent Tuesday evenings and shoe shops and toy narratives and a parking garage on a Saturday afternoon, that there is someone beside them whose presence is structural. But then she thought about Marcus and realized the true shape of the thing. Han had meant every word and had not needed to use a single one of them, because Marcus had not been disappeared by Han's power, or Han's lawyers, or the quiet, systematic machinery of influence that Han could mobilize with a phone call. Marcus had been disappeared by himself, by the decade of decisions made in the dark and the comfortable assumption that darkness was permanent, by the cruelty compounded on cruelty, the debt compounded on debt, the fundamental structural dishonesty of a life built on surfaces that couldn't bear weight. Han had turned the lights on. The rest had been gravity. And the deeper truth, the one she had understood standing at a sink in a restroom, looking at her own face in the mirror, was that Marcus had disappeared from her life the moment his hand made contact with her cheek. Not because of what followed, but because of what she felt in the seconds after, which was nothing that had anything to do with him. The stillness, the steady hands, the 3 words typed without trembling, the walk away that required no effort because she had been walking away from him, from everything he represented, from the version of herself that had believed his version of her. For years already, he had raised his hand and found no one there to devastate because Imani had not been in the place he expected to find her for a very long time. She had been here. On this beach, or the idea of this beach, this specific combination of the right man and the right children and the right light and the right silence, building her way toward it one night shift and one online course and one 30-pound deposit at a time. Zara's voice carrying up the beach, instructing her brother with the patient authority of someone who has decided the lesson will be learned today, regardless of how many waves it takes. Han reached over, his hand found hers on the sand. Didn't say anything, didn't need to. The sun continued its descent toward the water. The light continued doing what late afternoon light does on a west-facing coast. The dog continued its joyful, purposeless arcs. The waves continued their conversation with the shore, patient, consistent, and arriving and receding and arriving again with the absolute reliability of something that has been doing this since before any of them existed and will continue long after. And Imani sat in the warmth of it all, fully present, fully here, in the life she had built before anyone was watching, in the life that had always been coming, in the life that, it turned out, had been worth every single thing it cost to reach. The real victory was never Marcus losing everything. Not the job, not the apartment, not the car disappearing from the pavement on a Wednesday morning, while he stood there with his keys in his hand and the specific silence of a life contracting around him. Not the bankruptcy filing, not the girlfriend's careful, dignified statement. Not the viral video that had been viewed millions of times by people who had never met any of them and never would, but who recognized something in 47 seconds of footage that made them stop scrolling and feel something real. None of that was the victory. The victory was quieter than any of that. smaller in its dimensions and larger in its meaning and entirely invisible to anyone who had not been paying attention to the right things from the beginning. The victory was a woman who refused to stay broken, not dramatically, not with a speech or a declaration or the kind of defiant, cinematic rising that stories sometimes impose on people who have simply done the harder, less visible thing of continuing. Just the daily, private, structurally invisible refusal. Get up, make the bottle, go to work, come home. Study, sleep, get up again. Performed without audience and without applause in a single room on the third floor of a house, with thin walls and a window facing a brick wall, and a radiator that worked on its own schedule? The victory was that she never stopped. Not when the note was on the counter, not when the hospital room was empty of everyone except her. And this new, fierce, blinking person she had grown alone, and delivered alone and held alone in the specific fluorescent silence of a maternity ward at 3 in the morning? Not when the call center manager was contemptible. Not when the office floors needed scrubbing at midnight. Not when the operations management module almost broke her in week 4. Not when the 30 pounds felt like nothing against the size of the future she was trying to build. She never stopped. That was the victory. Everything else, Han. The foundation, the beach, the yellow coat, the children at the water's edge, the shoe bag swinging from her hand on a Tuesday afternoon in a mall that had once been the site of her public humiliation and was now just a place that sold children's shoes. All of it was the consequence of the victory, not the victory itself. The victory happened in the moments no one saw, and Han, who had stood in a corridor on a Tuesday night, and felt something anomalous enough in the quality of a stranger's presence to stay longer than his errand required, who had come back the following Tuesday not from strategy but from the simple, honest pull of someone who has encountered something they don't fully understand yet, and finds the incomprehension interesting rather than inconvenient, who had brought coffee without making it a gesture, who had asked about the courses and listened to the answers, and asked follow-up questions that revealed he had absorbed every word, who had seen her, not the cleaned-up version, not the version she might have constructed if she had known she was being observed by someone whose opinion would matter, the actual version. Tired, determined, scrubbing conference tables at 11 p.m., photograph of her daughter tucked into the frame of the cleaning cart, 30 pounds a week going into an account called Future, studying at midnight with the brightness turned all the way down. He had seen all of that, and his response had not been pity or condescension or the unconscious repositioning of a powerful man who has identified an opportunity to be someone's rescue. His response had been recognition, the specific, quiet recognition of a person who has spent enough time among people performing strength to know the real thing when it's standing in front of him in a cleaning uniform at midnight, not performing anything for anyone. He had seen her strength before. She had fully seen it herself. Not because she lacked it, she had never lacked it, but because strength, when you are inside it and using every gram of it simply to keep moving, is not always visible to its owner in the way it is visible to someone watching from outside. He had seen it and decided with the settled certainty of a man who trusts his own judgment, because he has spent years earning the right to, that whatever this was, it was worth returning for. That was its own kind of victory. The victory of being truly seen by someone who had no reason to see you and every resource to look elsewhere, and chose, on a Tuesday night and every Tuesday night that followed, to look at you instead. And then there was the life itself, the rebuilt life, the one that had been constructed not in spite of everything that happened, but in some essential way because of it, not because suffering is ennobling or because hardship is a prerequisite for depth, but because Imani had taken the raw material of the hardest years and refused to let them produce only damage. She had extracted something from them, had learned things that could not have been learned any other way, had developed in the furnace of those years a clarity about what mattered and what didn't, that most people spend entire comfortable lifetimes never achieving. She knew what love was not because she had been shown, and so when love arrived, real love, structural love, the kind that shows up at 6:43 and sits across from a 4-year-old for 10 minutes, discussing a toy narrative with complete seriousness, she recognized it without hesitation, and without the second guessing that haunts people who have never had a clear negative example to calibrate against. The past had not been wasted, it had been alchemized, turned, through the specific, daily, unglamorous work of a woman who refused to let it be only what it was, into the foundation of everything that came after. And now the past simply stopped mattering. Not because it had been forgotten. Memory is not so accommodating, and Imani had never asked it to be. But because the present had become so genuinely, completely, non-performatively full that the past had been reduced to its accurate proportions. A chapter, significant but finished, in a story that had turned out to have far more pages than the difficult early ones suggested. The note in the kitchen drawer, the single room with the brick wall window, the mop and the cart, and the photograph of Zara tucked into its frame, the 30 pounds, the account called Future, all of it behind her now, not gone. Present in the way that foundations are present, invisible beneath everything standing on them, necessary and load-bearing and never requiring acknowledgement from the structure above to continue doing their work. And all of it, every chapter, every Tuesday night, every choice made in the dark, began with 3 words. Not the 3 words Marcus expected when he slapped her in a luxury mall and watched her reach into her bag. He had expected tears or rage or the public unraveling of a woman he had decided was still the person he left on the step stool. He had expected to find her exactly where he needed her to be for his story about himself to remain intact. He had expected devastation. He found 3 words typed with steady hands by a woman who had not been devastatable for years. "I need you," said to the right person, for the right reasons. With the full, unashamed, non-negotiable weight of a woman who had learned, through every hard, invisible, accumulative inch of the road that brought her to that moment, that needing the right person is not weakness. It is the whole point. It is what all the strength was for. Not to arrive at a place where you need no one, but to arrive at a place where the person you need is worthy of being needed. Where I need you is not a confession of dependency, but a statement of trust so complete, so earned, so grounded in years of consistent evidence, that saying it feels less like vulnerability and more like coming home. She had built herself strong enough to choose, and she had chosen well: the beach, the light, the children at the water's edge. Han's hand finding hers on the sand without a word, the dog's joyful, purposeless arcs, the waves arriving and receding with the absolute patience of something that has been doing this forever, and will continue forever, and requires nothing from any of it except to keep moving. 3 words, the right 3 words, to the right person, at exactly the right time. And a life so completely rebuilt that the woman who had once sat on an apartment floor holding a mobile with tiny stars and moons would not have recognized it, would not have believed it was coming, but had built toward it anyway, every single day, in the dark, before anyone was watching.